Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Had the deadly coronavirus pandemic not intervened, we would have been in Tampa this week to cover the National Defense Industrial Association's annual SOFIC, the world's leading special operations conference and trade show. Now we are covering the virtual version of SOFIC called vSOFIC, where our coverage is sponsored by Bell, Elbit Systems of America, and Leonardo DRS. And we're honored to be joined by the commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command, United States Army General Rich Clarke. Sir, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Vago. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate you covering our first ever virtual SOFIC. It really means a lot that you and your audience are just taking a few minutes out of your time to do this today. Thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure, sir, and certainly a novel, first of its kind evolution. And certainly we talked to General Carlisle, who heads NDIA, about how some of the lessons learned are going to make shows stronger, whether we're meeting in person or doing it virtually. Let me start with the coronavirus pandemic. It's affecting everybody in the world, including military units. Your forces are engaged worldwide. How is the virus affecting Special Operations Command and Special Operations Forces?
Vago, SOFIC and the virtual SOFIC is just an indicator for our forces. It would have been very easy to quit. It would have been very easy not to do anything. But we moved on with instead of just canceling SOFIC, we went virtual because SOCOM doesn't quit. We're not going to give up, and I think most of all, we're adaptable. And that's how our forces are. Our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine that are, as you know, global right now. They've also adapted to what they need to do forward, and whether that means modifying how they come in contact with their partner forces, which they may do a little bit more of that virtual as the pandemic ebbs and flows. But we have adapted our forces to be able to both maintain our forward presence and continue to put the pressure on the violent extremist organizations forward, where we're working, as you noted, throughout the globe. But at the same time, we're making sure that our forces that are back here inside the continental U.S. are maintaining the readiness, and they're preparing to deploy as needed to go forward. The one thing that I think is noteworthy is the family aspect to this. And we continue also not just to take care of our forces and make sure they maintain their readiness and their forward presence, but we also have our families that can also be affected by this coronavirus, and we're making sure that they have all of the things that they need, whether it's the physical or the mental assets and capabilities to make sure that they can get through this coronavirus. While some of them may have loved ones that are deployed right now, we're making sure we keep them foremost and make sure that they're taken care
of. Your forces have spent the past 2 decades focused on countering violent extremist organizations, as the national defense strategy is shifting back to a great power mindset. And each of the military services has been making that transition. If you look at the Marine Corps, General Berger's strategy is to further tailor the Marine Corps to be aimed at the Pacific theater. And this great power return harkens back to your early days as a soldier during the Cold War, when we were looking at the Soviet Union as the primary pacing threat for the nation. When it comes to what you guys are doing, though, you have to balance doing those current operations that you'll be continuing with even less support from the rest of the forces as they sort of move on. You're going to have to continue dealing with ISIS's and Taliban's and God knows what other organizations around the world, while at the same time preparing and engaging in the Pacific and in Europe and elsewhere with great powers. Talk to us about how you're refocusing for what is going to be a very, very different future, and getting that balance right between the capabilities that you need on the low end and the capabilities you need on the high end?
Well, you packed a lot into that question, Vago, but well done. Let me start with a bit of a story. Uh, when I came to SOCOM slightly more than a year ago, my first trip overseas, that I took as the SOCOM commander was not to the Middle East. I didn't go to Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, like my predecessors had, because that was the main effort. My first trip to the overseas was actually into the Indo-Pacific, where I visited 6 countries throughout the region. And while there, when I went to places like the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, where there is a violent extremist threat, and something that we need to be aware of for the threats that are global. The one thing that I saw was that by countering violent extremists, you are actually working in the great power competition with other nations. The counter violent extremism fight that we've been in, as you said, 2 decades, I'd say it's even longer. It's not mutually exclusive. By being in a place like the Philippines that has concerns about things like China fishing and encroachment upon their borders, by the fact that we're there with the Filipino military and have established incredible decades-long engagements and partnerships with them, that will stand, I believe that will stand the test of time. And we will continue with those partnerships, which then give us access and placement for our special operations forces, but then largely the joint force going forward. So you raise a good point, but I continue to say that they're not mutually exclusive. And as the National Defense Strategy, it focused, as you pointed out, on nation state concerns, but it did not say that we're not focusing on the violent extremists. In fact, it still listed those as a long-term threat and a generational threat. So, and I can keep going on this, but I'll pause and see if you have any points.
Well, and certainly the mission in the Philippines has been one of success and was a long-running operation. So even though folks were focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, there was still the force was still engaging across the world in a whole series of valuable partnership and engagement operations like that had delivered real-world effect. I want to ask you a little bit about the nature of the competition going forward, because this is going to be a very different great power competition landscape. It's going to involve hybrid operations and tactics, a nexus of ununiform forces, proxies like the Wagner Group, cyber, information operations, electromagnetic. What are the skills that you've learned over the past 2 decades that are applicable to this new environment? And then what are the new skills and mindsets you need to operate successfully in this challenging environment?
Glad the way you phrased it, because there's what we can't do is forget all the great things that we've learned over the last 2 decades and throw them away and say, oh, now we have new problems. But some of the things that we have learned over the 2 decades that will still apply. We talked about one right up front, that the most important thing about our force, humans are more important than hardware. It's still, that's soft truth number 1. And that still remains. It is about having the right people that are adaptable, as I talked about. But what our people have done in the violent extremist fight by being deployed is that they continue to refine their problem-solving skills. They get to yes because they find creative solutions. They make sure they do it within legal, ethical, and moral bounds, but they figure out how to get to yes. And they figure out how to solve those problems as evidenced in really the thousands of missions that they have conducted over the last 20 years to keep our nation safe. And so that you're right, you're spot on by saying what's important that we've learned. In terms of, okay, what do we need to adapt to and what do we need to change to? I'd give you two specifically. Number one, and you hit it, was the information operations. Today, with the ubiquity of information that is out there, because of the speed of information flow, we actually have to make sure we understand it, where it's coming from, what is valid, who our adversaries are trying to influence, and we have to make sure that we understand that space. But then we also, from a military perspective, have to be able to counter that. And because there are a lot of mistruths, fallacies that are thrown out there, and we have to make sure that we are poised to do that. And then the one way that will help this, and one area in which we need to improve our skills that we're working towards, is artificial intelligence and machine learning. With the flow of information and things coming in, quick data, how can you use artificial machine tools? How can we develop the software that will help us to be able to pull throughout, literally tens of thousands of data sets and be able to distill it to the operator, the commander who is far forward at the edge, so that he or she can make the right decisions in the time and space of need. So, Vago, I hope that gets to what you're getting at.
It does. I mean, what are, in your view, the hard problems that you need solved? I mean, for example, we had a great conversation with Jim Smith, your acquisition executive, to start off this week. And he talked about the electromagnetic spectrum, about how your forces are now increasingly coming into contact, denying you information, denying you navigation coordinates, obviously jamming GPS and other communications are certainly in the order of battle of some of our great power competitors. Just like in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were new requirements for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, as well as biometrics and even improved personal firepower. Talk to us a little bit about what are the big, hard problems that you'd like industry and academia's help to solve.
Yeah, the list is long, but if I were going to,
I can imagine.
If I were to focus on a few things, because I think you're really talking, what do we need to, there's two different ways to look at this. What do we need to make our own forces more effective? But then also, what do we need? I think you were talking from an enemy perspective to keep our forces defended. You're really talking offense and defense. Is that a good way?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what are some of the things you need in order to safeguard yourself in this environment, but also pose much harder problems for your adversaries?
Yeah, no. On the defensive side, we're going to continue to look at countering enemy unmanned aerial surveillance. With our forces that are forward, sometimes disaggregated small teams, austere environments, we never had to worry about what was overhead before. We had the best Air Force in the world to protect us. Now with drones, with the capabilities that are sometimes off the shelf, and you can attach weapon systems to them and cameras to them pretty easily, we really have to look at countering adversaries' unmanned aerial surveillance. And you hit on another one that is really important, is the electronic warfare, where throughout the battlefield, it is getting easier and easier to jam some of our position navigation and timing capabilities, some of our own unmanned aerial systems that can be jammed. And so that's something we're going to have to work very hard with industry going forward. But from our side in problem solving, things we need for our forces, we're going to have to improve our own ISR, our own UAS systems going forward, so that that they're sustainable, affordable, and they provide our SOF forces both the ISR, their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, but they also we need to have them armed that can work in remote and austere environments. That's going to be something that we're going to have to look at long term, because the unmanned systems are not necessarily manpower light. They're
Right.
some of the most manpower intensive systems we have are actually our unmanned systems. So that's one we absolutely have to look at going forward. And the other one that I talked about earlier is the artificial intelligence, that we can see and sense in real time the information space, so our people can make decisions about what our adversaries are doing. So those are the two that I would focus on going forward for offense.
Is there a concern in your mind that SOF may not get the support for the kinds of things that you do at what folks would consider sort of the lower end, as they focus on the high end, which is why you're going to have to organically build some of these capabilities? It's no ding against the Air Force, right? They're going to be focusing on a different part of the battle and the conflict, just as the Army is now acknowledging that the Army itself doesn't have the missile defenses for its own assets, much less some of the other services. Do you think that that's one of the reasons that's going to drive you in that direction?
No, I honestly, Vago, I don't. I got obviously great relationship with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Goldfein. We talk often, along with the Chief of Staff of the Army, General McConville. Both men I consider friends. And what I have always seen is that if there is a SOCOM specific need, that they will meet it, and we'll continue. If there's something that our forces need, I will continue to advocate for those specific requirements. But I would also highlight, though, is we have to prioritize. SOF has to prioritize, because we can't be everywhere for everyone in the counterterrorism fight. And so we have to do those things that are SOCOM specific, and we have to do those things that are SOF specific tasks. And I'll give you one example of that, and that's things like the Security Force Assistance Brigades that the Army has developed. And some people looked at that as a competition with SOCOM. I look at those brigades that the Army has stood up. One, they're great for the Army because they don't disaggregate an Army brigade, but they are also great for SOCOM, because there was a times that we were providing advisory efforts in places that were really better suited for the Army and a conventional Army unit to conduct. So I think that's an example of something that actually helps SOCOM in the long run.
When folks think about SOCOM, they sort of had a very clear understanding of what that mission was in an Iraq, Afghanistan, or even a counter-ISIS from those perspectives. And obviously the force has been engaged in global partnership training, right? Helping our allies and friends, or even people who we might not consider friends, but maybe we're all trying to get to the same place. There's an understanding of those kinds of missions. Talk to us a little bit about when it comes to great power competition, and whether it's deterring, countering, shaping, engaging, and whatever other adjective you want to use, when it comes to Russia and China, what the role of the force there is for people who may be having a little bit of trouble conceptualizing what this new challenge means for you guys and what you guys bring to the table.
Yeah, I don't put it as a new challenge per se. This is a little bit like going back to the future, and for an example, we put special forces teams in Germany in the late 50s and 60s, at that time, West Germany, and at that time into Berlin, in a divided city, when the Iron Curtain and the wall was still up. And at that point in time, they worked operations plans in the event that at that time, the Soviet Union invaded. And subsequently, we've seen that those same teams conducting unconventional warfare and partnering with European forces could have worked in the rear areas of the Russians. And the Russians, in subsequent reports that have now been declassified, the Russians were absolutely focused on finding those teams, trying to root them out, because they knew in a war plan that they could cause havoc in the Russian rear area, in places like Berlin. And today, as we have our special operations forces in Europe right now, we continue to partner in places like the Baltics, in places like Poland, where we're working with their special operations forces to make sure that they are trained and proficient, and that we have good partnerships in Europe to be able to defend to our partners there. So I hope, Vago, that gets to your question and gives a little bit of construct of how we're organizing and thinking about this.
It does, and I don't necessarily want to dwell on it because I know you guys are thinking about concepts of operations that you are definitely not going to be discussing in this forum. One of the big challenges, and as you mentioned, is setting priorities. And Dr. Esper has been talking about the flattening of defense budgets since he took office, and that was something that he was focused on when he was Army Secretary as well. And he has now been very honest that the coronavirus national response to try to provide stimulus and get the economy restarted is going to take a toll on defense spending. How are you thinking about the financial environment going forward, and how is that going to help and shape the choices you may have to make?
I make it simple. It really is still going to come down to, for us, for prioritization going forward. And while I can't presuppose what change to our budget will come, if or when it does come for any change, we'll modify. As I said, we are adaptable and can figure that out. I think, and this ties to some of your broader questioning, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about it for a second, is what we can't afford to do is develop two different forces. And that's really our focus. I can't develop one force that only does counterterrorism and violent extremism, and only develop equipment that is for that. All the equipment that we're now looking at, and all things that we are going to look at acquiring and developing into the future as we look at our acquisition teams, is going to make sure that it has multiple use capabilities. So it can be used both in a counter China, counter Russia, high-end need, but it can also be used in a VEO, violent extremist organization fight. So I hope that goes a little bit to what you're getting at, Vago.
It does indeed. And let me ask you one last question, which is on the comprehensive review. That was, obviously there were a couple of challenging and unfortunate incidents. You have a highly motivated force, highly intelligent, hard-charging people doing very dangerous work, and sometimes under stress levels that are sort of unimaginable for most people, and even stressful by your own forces standards. What are the key takeaways from that comprehensive review? And how are you, what are you getting right? What are you getting wrong when it comes to sort of the ethics and the culture of the force? Because this is very much a case where a handful of examples are sort of tarnishing the tremendous work that many, many thousands are doing on a daily basis.
The primary purpose of that review? was to make us better. And I think if you just look at the amount of resources that we put into that review, to take a hard look at ourselves. I picked a brigadier general, now 2-star, along with a 30-person team to go out to all of our components. They literally conducted thousands of interviews and spent a significant amount of time. And with myself and my senior enlisted leader and our leadership team up here at SOCOM have spent hundreds of hours looking hard at ourselves. So first, in order to make us better, we really had to look hard at ourselves. And this is something that was needed after a decade since almost since the last time kind of a hard setback look was taken. And what was great to see was that all of our commanders and senior enlisted leaders are vested, and they want to ensure that the incidents that you just mentioned, that we absolutely reduce those, and that our forces that are for defending and that are preparing to go forward to defend our nation are doing things always with the utmost discipline and conduct at all times. And so the thing that we will continue to work on is ensuring that all elements of our force are focused on not just the employment, not just on the actual getting out the door and being deployed, but make sure that they are involved in the ethics and training and development and leadership for all of our forces, from the minute someone comes in to our formation until the minute they leave, and even beyond, that we're taking care of our force to make sure that we have the highest ethics displayed at all times. So I really do appreciate you, as you said, asking your last question on this, because it's important to us. And we're going to make sure that we are providing the best people at all times to defend our nation. Thanks, Vago. I really appreciate it.
Sir, thank you very much for spending so much time with us. We really, really appreciate it, and look forward to talking again and continuing to engage with the tremendous team you have down there, and look forward to seeing you again, and especially next year down in sunny Tampa, if not anywhere else. Thanks so much again, sir.
Hey, thanks, Vago. I appreciate it, and we look forward to having a real SOFIC in person next year.
Thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. Check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman, and our broader Navy coverage that's sponsored by Fincantieri Marinette Marine. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.